while he met his enormous expenditures by levies on conquered territory. He built hospitals out of tribute paid by brothels. Then he closed the brothels, although he kept boys around him for his own amusement. He gleaned money for his fleet by raiding the Italian merchantmen, and then forced Venice and Genoa — he delighted in playing one off against the other — to pay high for the privileges of the Egyptian ports. He could be a most able administrator when he chose. Letters brought to his headquarters were answered within the day, and the answers dictated to his secretaries went out swiftly by pigeon post, galloper, and fast galley. Language was no barrier to this much-travelled tyrant, and when his secretaries were brought to despair by one of his long absences, he would be apt to dismount at his headquarters and come in upon them unannounced, to work through the night hours over communications in Greek, Arabic, Maghrebian, Turkish. He exchanged letters and ambassadors with Charles of Anjou and the Venetians, with the Spanish kings and Conradin, the last of the Hohenstaufen. By spies and merchants and friends among the Europeans, he kept his finger on events, knowing that Germany was divided in civil war, Italy prostrate after the long strife between the Emperor and Pope, and the French Crusaders driven from Constantinople at last. He worked steadily and effectively to isolate the Crusaders in Syria from their people in Europe. The Panther had two ambitions: to defeat the Mongol Khans and to drive the Crusaders out of the East. And as Saladin had done, he called for the jihad, the holy war against the infidels. Meanwhile, for Baibars had too much common sense to make war in haste, he carried out certain preparations of his own. To discourage another crusader by sea, he blocked up the Damietta Channel with rocks and moved the city itself back up the river. He built signal towers along the coast, organized a relay pigeon post between Cairo and Damascus. To strengthen his frontiers and to add to his treasury, he seized Damascus treacherously, accusing its lord of allying himself with the Mongols. Including the Armenians in this accusation, he marched north and ravaged the hill castles that had been secure even in Saladin's wars. With throngs of captives and an Armenian prince, and camel trains of spoil, he left the mountain ranges and the ruins of the castles smoking behind him. To impress Christian and assassin envoys who visited him during this march, he mutilated and then put to death 500 Armenian captives. To his men, on the eve of the jihad, he issued a proclamation that Napoleon might have given out before a new campaign. The King of the French, the King of England, the Emperor of Germany, and the Roman Emperor have marched against us aforetime. They have vanished like a storm chased by the wind. May they come again. May he come, the King Charles, and the Greek with him, and even the Mongol. We will enrich ourselves with their treasures, and will be glorified as victors in the holy war. In spite of this challenge, Baibars did not wish to call down upon his head a general crusade. He kept his fingers on the pulse of Europe through the Venetians, who now frankly made alliances with the Muslims, and he kept an eye on the doings of the Mongols in Persia through his spies. He had set his heart on clearing the Crusaders from the coast of the Holy Land, which Saladin had not been able to accomplish, and he planned deftly to do this without rousing Europe to a new crusade. To march against the formidable knights who had been strengthening their network of castles from Jaffa to Antioch was a task calling for the utmost care and skill. Glory was to be had, of course, in driving out the infidels, but hard knocks and little spoil as well. Baibars did not underestimate his foes in the slightest. He wanted, of course, to round out his new empire by clearing the coast, but more than that, he looked upon this task as a duty. Pagliacci had a soul under all the paint and pantomime. During his peregrinations, Baibars had examined most of the Crusader citadels, and he knew the ground thoroughly. Some 30 fortified points confronted him, ranging from huge Antioch, with its 100,000 motley inhabitants, to the Crac de Chevalier, with its enormous walls and population of soldiers, to small citadels of the sea like Tyre, and isolated towers garrisoned by a few Templars or Hospitallers. He understood that the Crusaders were no longer able to put an army in the field against him, unless a new crusade should be launched. So he made his plans to strike at the citadels one at a time by swift thrusts that depended upon surprise and weight of numbers and power of siege engines for rapid success. Like Hannibal, he had a varied but devoted host behind him, made up of trained Mamluks, Berber and Arab levies, with the Negroes of the Sudan. Such a force, even more than Saladin's, was formidable in victory, but undependable when checked for any time. And Baibars had all a Tartar's instinct for secrecy and swiftness of action. The Crusaders knew when he led his army from Cairo for the first blow in 1265. Baibars marched rapidly north from Jerusalem, and they were watching for him around Acre when his black standard suddenly appeared before the small walled town of Caesarea in the south. His Mamluks stormed the outer wall and set up their siege engines, brought up in pieces on camel and mule back before the citadel, which held out for a week. The Panther turned over the castle to his men to plunder, while he worked with his own hands at raising the fortifications. He had determined to destroy all the cities on the coast which had been rallying points for the Crusaders. While 2 divisions of his cavalry overran Haifa and menaced Chateau Pèlerin just north of the lost Caesarea, Baibars turned south with his infantry and siege engines and invested Arsuf. The knights, watching from the parapet while the Muslims set up their camp, noticed a solitary Mamluk, a tall figure in a long coat of mail that hung to his ankles, and carrying a shield, walking without haste between the lines. The Muslims did not point at the wanderer or display any interest in him while he inspected the foundation stones of the wall and the gate towers. Nor did the knights observe that he had one blue eye and one white eye. They did see him presently working the siege engines, and when, after a month, Arsuf surrendered, they discovered him to be the Sultan. Baibars made the captives pull down the walls stone by stone, and, in spite of his promise to free them, paraded them in triumph into Cairo with the banners reversed and broken crosses hanging from their necks. It was his way of bringing the fruit of the jihad to Cairo, and in the next year he had bloodier tokens to show, for the hill castle of Safed was beset, and when its wearied Templars surrendered, they were put to death, all but one who turned Muslim, and one who was spared to carry the tidings of the massacre to the remaining strongholds of the Crusaders. To the exulting Mamluks, who had seen 3 citadels fall to them, this was a sign of victory. The end of the unbelievers was written in the book of fate, and what was written would come to pass. They felt assured that they were the instruments of fate, destined to reap with their swords the final harvest of Christian lives that would atone for all the past. They did not realize that Baibars had bloodied them carefully upon 3 of the weakest strongholds, and by so doing had intimidated the other citadels. While the Crusaders appealed for armed aid from Hathon, the Mongols, and Europe, Baibars consented to take 15,000 pieces of gold from Bohemond VI of Antioch for a truce, while he went north to punish Hathon for daring to support the Mongols. A tale is told that he wandered incognito into the far-distant country of Asia Minor, where, at a roadside pastry shop, he dismounted to eat fruit and cake. When he went out of the shop, he left his ring on a table. After he rejoined his army, he sent a courier to the Mongol Ilkhan, explaining that he had lost his signet ring in a certain pastry shop belonging to the Khan, and asking that it be returned to him. Even on the path of war, Baibars would have his jest. He was vastly amused, no doubt, the next year, when he heard that the Venetians and Genoese, their feud being then at its height, had fought a naval battle off the coast of the Holy Land. But he heard also that St. Louis, informed of the situation in Palestine, had taken the cross again, and was assembling his second great crusade. Chapter 55. A Letter to Bohemond. The news spurred Baibars to make his real effort in the following spring, 1268. In March he appeared without warning before the gates of Jaffa, the only town remaining to the Crusaders in the south. He stormed it, tore it down, and sent its marble columns back to Cairo to enrich a new mosque, the Dahira. These massive marbles had been shaped by skilled Greek hands in forgotten times. Now, seized by the eager hands of ragged Falahis, they were reared into place within the courtyard of baked clay, while the human swarms of the alleys and the ragged watermen of the Nile chanted in admiration of the work of the triumphant king. Baibars, with his armoured horsemen, his creaking carts and camel trains, with his silk-clad negroes herding captive crusaders in chains, with frantic dervishes screaming an endless song of victory, climbed to the cold Lebanon and set up his engines before Belfort. The castle that had defied Saladin held out for only 10 days, and the Sultan's eunuchs had new captives to scourge along the road. Then the army went down to graze its horses and to reap the harvest of the fields of Banyas, where the waters of the Jordan come to the surface of the earth beneath a red cliff. And Baibars disappeared. A day or so later, a party of envoys from the Sultan entered the double gate of Tripoli's castle, and demanded speech with Bohemond VI, whom they called the Count. They were led to the upper courtyard, where knights and men-at-arms gathered round them, and Bohemond made his appearance on a tower stairway. He had come down from his city of Antioch, that his ancestor, the first Bohemond, had wrested from the Turks nearly 2 centuries before. And 2 centuries of luxury, surrounded by Greeks and served by Syrians, had left their mark on the Prince of Antioch, who was Norman only in lineage. He had bought a peace from Baibars, but still, being fearful, he had journeyed south to Tripoli, his other city, to watch events. The leader of the Egyptian envoys spoke to him boldly, addressing him as Count Bohemond, and accusing him of breaking the terms of the truce. But Bohemond still had something of Norman pride, and he whispered to his chamberlain, who upbraided the envoys, "Shape better your tongues, or be silent. It is well known to all men that my lord is Prince of Antioch, and by that title must you address him." The Mamluk, who was leader of the envoys, glanced about him covertly and hesitated. Then he shook his head. "Thus was the message given me to Al-Kumas, the Count, and not otherwise may I say what was said to me." The brow of the prince darkened, and he signed to his men-at-arms to surround the Muslims and seize them. As he did so, one of them, a tall groom who had been holding the horses, wandered over to the leading Mamluk. In so doing, the groom touched the officer's foot, and the Mamluk spoke at once to Bohemond. "Ya Prince, O Prince, content ye." The point was yielded by the Muslims, and their message delivered. While the talk went on, the tall groom continued his wanderings round the courtyard, staring up with his one good eye at the walls, at the weapons of the garrison, and at Bohemond himself. When the Prince of Antioch dismissed his visitors, the groom neglected to hold the stirrups of the Mamluks. He mounted a charger himself, and rode off among them. And outside the gate of the town he rocked in the saddle, roaring with laughter. "To the devil with all countships and princedoms," he cried. Baibars had added the part of a groom to his other roles, and the experience amused him vastly. Perhaps it suggested to him what followed, or perhaps he had already planned it out. He disappeared again from the valley below Banyas, but this time he took the pick of his army with him. 2 weeks later, at the end of May, a letter arrived at the castle of Tripoli for Bohemond. It was brought by an unarmed Muslim, not the Sultan in disguise this time, who disappeared after it was taken from him. Bohemond, opening the missive, beheld at the foot of it Baebar's heavy signature, and when he had read it through he sat without moving or speaking, as if stunned by an unseen blow. When his companions knew the contents of the letter, amazement and sorrow kept them silent. The letter was the masterpiece of the versatile Sultan. It began, "Greeting to the Count, and commiseration upon his misfortune inflicted by Allah, who hath deprived him of his princedom, and left to him for consolation only his countship. Know, O Count, thou who believest thyself to be Prince of Antioch art not, for we are Lord of Antioch, thy rich and fruitful city. Sword in hand, we swept through thy city on the 4th hour of Saturday, the 4th day of Ramadan. If thou hadst seen thy knights rolled under the hoofs of our horses, thy palaces trampled by the plunderers who filled their bags with booty, thy treasures weighed out by the heaviest weights, thy fair women hawked in the streets at 4 for a dinar, and bought with thine own gold. If thou hadst seen thy churches broken in, their crosses shattered, their lying gospels tossed from hand to hand in the open under the sun, the tombs of thy noble forefathers overturned, while thy foe the Muslims trod upon thy holy of holies, slaughtering monks and priests and deacons like sheep, leading out the rich to misery and nobles of thy blood to slavery. Couldst thou have seen the flames licking up thy halls, thy dead cast into the flames temporal, while the flames eternal awaited them, the churches of the apostles rocking and going down, then wouldst thou have said, O God, that I were dust. Since no man of thine hath escaped to tell thee the tale, I tell it thee." In this way the panther ended the dispute as to whether Bohemond was prince or count. He had written only the truth. His horsemen surprised the great city and stormed the hastily guarded wall that had been thought impregnable, and the gardens of the Crusaders were drenched in the blood of a fearful massacre. 8,000 souls crowded into the citadel on the height above Antioch, and these were granted their lives. The Muslims snatched from the burning city spoil almost beyond counting. Gold was tallied by the vase-full, and young girl slaves were handed about among the camel-men for 5 dirhams a head. The blow had fallen like lightning from a fair sky, and within a week Antioch was populated only by swarms of merchants and thieves, grubbing in the ruins and bargaining for spoil in the markets. In the south, the Crusaders heard the tidings with incredulity, but except for the unfortunate Bohemond, it affected them little, since Antioch had grown apart from the Holy Land generations before. They waited anxiously to learn where Baibars would strike next, and he had lopped off the extreme south and the north of their line of citadels that year. But in the next spring, 1269, Baibars contented himself with some grim manoeuvres. He vanished for a while, allowing the report to be sent forth that he was dead. Apparently he had been criticized for his treachery in breaking his treaties with the Christians, and wished in this way to trick them into giving him cause for a fresh invasion. Twice he failed to surprise the black stronghold of Margab, held by the Hospitallers. Once he materialized without armor and with 40 horsemen on the summit of the hill of the Crack under the castle walls. He challenged the knights to come out to individual combat, then rode off again. He harvested the fields of the knights and staged a small triumph ornamented with Christian heads in Damascus. but in reality he was holding his army in readiness to meet the Crusade of St. Louis. The energetic Sultan, however, did more than await the coming of the French king. On learning the numbers and strength of the crusade, which included the forces of Charles of Anjou, the chivalry of Navarre, and a small contingent of English led by their Prince Edward, he attempted to turn it aside, and succeeded. At Baybar's urging, the Muslim lord of Tunis wrote to St. Louis that he was prepared to aid the Crusaders against the Sultan, and inviting them to land upon the African coast in his territory. He also sent a large sum of money to prove his good faith. Just how the intrigue was carried out and how the king was induced to sail to Tunis is not known. Suffice it that he went thither, as Baybars had desired, in July 1270. Landing in that time of heat and dust after the country had been desolated by a famine, St. Louis found that the Emir of Tunis had betrayed him, and that the Muslims were in arms against him. The Crusaders pressed the siege of the white-walled city above the stagnant salt marshes, in spite of the dust storms that swept through their camps, and the bad water, and the harrying of the Berber clans who rode down from the southern hills. Beholding them so situated, a poet of Tunis recalled the poem of victory sung at Cairo 20 years before, and he wrote, "O King of France, thou wilt find this land a sister of Egypt. Prepare thee for what fate hath in store for thee here. Thou wilt find here the tomb in place of the house of Lokman, and thy eunuch here will be the angel of death." Fate added the gift of prophecy to the wit of the Muslim singer. Within a month the plague made its appearance in the Christian host, and the king was afflicted with his son, who had been born in the stress of the terrible days at Damietta, and who was now entering manhood. They carried the weakening St. Louis out to the shore, near the hills where once Carthage had reared its walls. Here, under the scattered eucalyptus and cedars, a breath of cool air came in from the sea. The king and his son lay on blankets stretched on the brown wisps of dead grass and poppies under open pavilions. The servants of the church ministered to them, but could not check the plague in the bodies weakened by dysentery. The son died before the father, and the day came when the thin form of the king turned on its side, and his voice was heard, "God have mercy on these, thy people. Lead them to safety in their own land, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem." Within a week, the height over the Red Bluff was deserted. The Crusaders had left, taking with them the body of their dead king. The Arab shepherds and the brown sheep returned to the shore. The muezzins called from the small towers in the white-walled villages. The warriors of the tribes rode in to look at the remnants of the Crusaders' camps, and lean dervishes pointed out the spot where St. Louis had died. So the crusade came to its end in vain, the last of the great crusades. Such were the tidings that reached Cairo and filled Baybars with infinite satisfaction. He himself had seen St. Louis in chains at Mansoura, and now, thanks to the trap he had set for him at Tunis, the great king of the Crusaders was being carried to his tomb. The fire of the jihad seized upon the men of Cairo anew, and Baybars decided to break down the strongest outpost of the knights in the Holy Land. In the spring 1271, he led his terrible siege circus against the Crac des Chevaliers, the headquarters of the Hospitallers. For more than a century, this square citadel of white stone had crowned the bare hills at the edge of the assassin country. Unchallenged, even by Saladin, it had guarded approach to the Templars' little town of Tortosa and Tripoli on the coast. 2 weeks after Baybar set up his engines on the plateau where the stone aqueduct runs into the southern bastions of the Crac, the mighty citadel drew down its banners and surrendered, the surviving knights being allowed to go forth with their lives. Baibars repaired the damage done to the walls and placed an inscription with his name and the date of the capture upon one of the towers. He intended to use the great fortress as a base for future operations against the coast, and he wrote to Hugh of Revel, commander of the Hospitallers, announcing his achievement. To brother Hugh, we will make clear to thee what God hath just now done for us. Thou didst fortify this place, and didst trust the guard of it to the choicest of thy brethren. Well, thou hast done nothing but hasten their deaths, and their deaths will be thy loss. The Panther was now the neighbour of his victim, Bohemond, formerly Prince of Antioch, and now merely Count of Tripoli. With his Mamluks, the Sultan raided the fields of Tripoli, gathering in crops and fruits and sugar-cane. Bohemond, shut up within his castle at Tripoli, made the natural mistake of protesting that Baibars had broken the truce for which the Count had paid anew. Baibars was not at a loss for a reply. "Nay, I have come only to gather in thy harvests and the vintages of thy vines. By God, I hope to pay thee a like visit each year." Bohemond could do nothing but keep to the shelter of his castle, and later in the summer he received a second message from the Panther. The bearer of it brought also some heads of game, which he said were a gift from the Sultan to the Count. The second message was brief as the first. "The rumour runs that thou hast renounced the chase, and darest not stir out of thy town. So we send thee these heads of game to console thee." Baibars, however, had not lingered near Tripoli. Swiftly he marched south with his circus and captured Montfort, the stronghold of the Teutonic Knights on the breast of the hills within sight of Acre. After taking it, he decided to raze it to the ground, and the stout walls were pulled down, the stones scattered in the gorge. Baibars' captures, apparently haphazard, had been methodical. First, he had cleared the Palestine coast, as far as the strong point of Chateau Pèlerin. Then he had swept over North Syria, seizing Antioch and the rich cultivated lands and the caravan roads to the coast. Then he had cleared the Crusaders from their last citadels in the line of the hills, so that only narrow strips of coast at Acre and Tripoli remained to them, and they had actually their backs to the sea. They could not ride inland for a half hour without coming among the Muslims. Chapter 56. Asia sends forth its horde. One man alone answered their appeals for aid. Edward, Prince of England, had taken the cross, and, with a few hundred adventurous knights and men-at-arms, joined the Crusade of St. Louis, arriving at Tunis after the death of the king, when the other lords were preparing to sail home. This Edward would not do. Having taken the cross, he meant to carry out his vow. "By the blood of God," he swore, "I shall go to Acre if all others leave me but Faure my valet." With his Princess Eleanor and his small following, he landed in the port of Acre in time to hear of the loss of the crack. Unable to take the field against the Sultan, he had to content himself with short raids inland, which troubled Baibars enough to turn his attention to the young English crusader. In Edward's case, Baibars chose to draw the dagger, not the sword, and that treacherously. Either he enlisted the aid of the assassins, or he hired murderers from Jaffa who passed themselves off as assassins. They penetrated the English camp with the usual throngs of hangers-on and assailed the prince in his tent. Taken by surprise, Edward defended himself valiantly, seizing and wrestling with the Muslims until aid came to him. He was wounded in the arm and side, and the weapons of the murderers seemed to have been poisoned. His wounds became infected, and he lay prostrate in his tent, cared for by his youthful wife, and apparently doomed to a slow death by blood poisoning. No surgeon of that time could operate in such a case, but Eleanor never ceased her ministrations. The chronicle relates that when her husband slept, she lay by his side and licked the rankling wounds with her tongue, until they closed. They who beheld her doing so expected her to be stricken, but she received no hurt. At the end of the year, in which all his efforts could accomplish nothing, the English prince sailed home reluctantly. He had tried to establish contact with the Mongols beyond the Euphrates, and in 1274, when he was again in England and occupied with affairs there, a Mongol embassy visited Europe and reached the papal court. A letter carried by the embassy was forwarded to Edward. It was written by the Mongol Khan Abaka from Persia, and offered alliance to the English prince for the conquest of the Holy Land. Edward, still cherishing hope of giving aid to Jerusalem, felt unable to leave his own kingdom. "The resolution you have taken," he wrote Abaka in response, "to relieve the Holy Land from the enemies of Christianity is most grateful to us, and we thank you. But we cannot at present send you any certain news about the time of our arrival in the Holy Land." It is a curious turn in the tide of events. The princes of Christendom, no longer in sympathy with the Crusades, involved in their own quarrels and achievements at home, while a Mongol lord prepares to enter the Holy Land in the face of the Muslim power. Baibars heard the rumble of the Mongol juggernaut from afar, and exerted himself to ward off catastrophe. He had been occupied in combing the assassins out of their citadels north of the Crack, and one by one he mastered the summits of the dark hills in which they had lived isolated for so long. Masyaf, the stronghold of the order, which was now becoming a domesticated people without political ambition, Kadmus and Kaf, the great cavern atop a precipice, yielded to him. He swept north and brought the Armenian mountaineers to heel again. He pressed on into Asia Minor, but had to turn back to watch the Mongols in 1275. For weeks, with his scouts quartering over the eastern plains and his divisions under arms in strategic points, the panther crouched alert. He never went to his tent to sleep without fast horses waiting, ready saddled at the entrance. He slept in his clothes, even to his spurs. The test of strength, however, did not come in his lifetime. He did trounce a division of Mongols, 12,000 strong, and he held Armenia safe. But the Mongols, discovering that the Crusaders could do nothing to support them, confined themselves to ravaging and breaking up the dominion of the Seljuks in Asia Minor. Baibars was well content not to interfere with them, and after the loss of his fleet with which he had planned to invade Cyprus, he left the survivors of the Crusaders unmolested, while he withdrew to Cairo to watch the building of his new mosques and a great university. In the gateways of these new structures he placed the columns of devastated Christian churches. For once he deserted the saddle and the path of war, because he had been wounded in the last conflict with the Mongols, and from this wound he did not recover. In his last years he saw the Sudan added to the new Egyptian empire, with the sheriffs of Mecca and Medina. He had rebuilt Saladin's empire to its borders and beyond by the time of his death in 1277. He had been a fabulous and stormy figure, the nemesis of the Crusades, treacherous and murderous. He had filled the slave markets of the Khan el-Khalil in Cairo with Christians, and had instilled into his people the certainty that the Crusaders were doomed. Probably this would have happened in any case, because the Mongol upheaval in mid-Asia had driven into the Near East hordes of the barbaric clansmen from the steppes and the great ranges. Khwarezmians, Circassians, Eastern Turks, and Tatars, they had come to stay, and they formed the bulk of the new and invincible armies. A small tribe, unnoticed as yet, had aided the broken Seljuks against the Mongol conquerors. They were the Othmans, or Ottomans, destined to gain supremacy in the plateaus of Asia Minor within a generation, and to sweep thereafter over Eastern Europe, and, in time, to become lords of Constantinople. It has been said so often, and too often, that the loss of the Crusaders' kingdom was caused altogether by the weakening of the crusading spirit in Europe, that it is well to reflect upon this inroad of the clansmen of mid-Asia. Beginning after the first invasion of Genghis Khan in 1220, and ending with the growth of the three empires, the Mamluk dominion in Egypt, the Mongol Khanate in Persia, and the Ottoman Empire in Asia Minor at the end of the 13th century, this inroad defeated all the efforts of the Crusaders. Remember that the Kharizmians out of the Caspian steppes wrested Jerusalem away the last time. The Kharizmians and the Mamluks annihilated the Christian knights and descendants of Saladin at Gaza after this loss of Jerusalem. And the citadels of the Crusaders were lost to the Mamluks, who were bred out of the debris swept before the Mongols, the Hungarians, Slavs, Georgians, and Tatars and Turks. These clansmen out of mid-Asia and north of the Black Sea, fragments of people cast up by the maelstrom of the Mongol invasion, became in time devout Muslims, and they were tempered by the old Arab culture of Saladin's time. By numbers, by their very vitality and zeal for the new faith, they overwhelmed the Crusaders. St. Louis and Edward both landed at Acre with forces that might have prevailed against the Muslim armies of the early days of the Crusades. But they were helpless in the face of the armies led by Baibars and the Mongol Ilkhans of Persia. The ascendancy of the Muslims in zeal, in numbers, and in military efficiency turned the scales against the Crusaders in the East, who no longer had support from Europe. Christendom was not aware as yet of the change, but it was now on the defensive. No longer could it invade the lands of Islam with any hope of success. The only chance left the Crusaders, at bay with their backs to the sea, was an alliance with the Mongols, who had gained prodigiously in culture during the last half-century. The court of the Mongol Ilkhan of Persia equalled that of Cairo, and surpassed the papal court at Rome in its knowledge and enterprise. Painters, architects, astrologers, and historians gathered around the seats of the Mongols. But this chance was passing beyond reach. Already the Qadis and Imams of Islam were assembled around the Ilkhan, and the Mongol nobles were being converted to the faith of Islam. Soon, in 1305, this conversion would be complete, and the Mongol conquerors would be merged in the great melting pot of the peoples of Islam. Baibars himself had managed to keep the remnant of the Crusaders apart from the Mongols. He alone had withstood the armies of the horde, and he had punished any prince who allied himself with the conquerors. Bohemond, for instance, and Edward of England, and Hathon of Armenia. While he kept the invading horde from his new empire, he so organized his state and army that it was able to endure. His successor, Kalawun, took over a strong military state. Upon Kalawun, as the Barca had bequeathed the obligation of the Roman war to Hannibal, Baibars had imposed the duty of driving the Crusaders from their last strongholds. The jihad must be fought to the end. Chapter 57. The Last Stand. Step by step, Kalawun prepared for his triumph. He even renewed truces with the Crusaders while he made ready. The ambitious Charles of Sicily, who now called himself King of Jerusalem, was glad to make an alliance with the Mamluk Sultan, and the Genoese aided Kalawun in secret, while the Venetians held aloof from the Holy Land. So the Sultan could be certain that no relief would be sent out from Europe to the Crusaders. Christendom would not interfere with his jihad. But someone else interfered. As Hulagu had done a generation before, the Mongol Ilkhan Abaka sent his army in motion toward Jerusalem, and the Christian Georgians joined the standard of the horde, while the Armenians flocked down again, and the knights rode from Magab to swell the army of the Khan. 30,000 Christians marched with the Mongols down the valley of Hamach in the autumn of 1281. And on the wide plain by the small lake of Homs, the Egyptian host gave battle to the invaders. For the first time the Mamluks were face to face with the full army of the Il Khan and his allies. No one knows exactly what followed, except that the battle was sudden and devastating, and that the mounted divisions of the Mongols and the Mamluks scattered over the plain in charges that carried them leagues from the camps. The right wing of the Mongols crushed everything before it, while Kalawun with his Khalkha held firm in the center. At the end of the day, Kalawun and his guard still held the field, while the Mongol cavalry had split into two parts, groping for each other, and the Christians, the Armenians and Georgians being infantry in the main, were left stranded by themselves. A Templar who observed the battle wrote to Edward, now King of England, that the Mongols rode off on the Muslim horses, which they preferred to their own. Beyond doubt they withdrew from the field the next day, and the Armenian and Georgian division was nearly annihilated in the long retreat on foot toward the mountains in the north. As Baibars had done, Kalawun had beaten off the Mongol attack, and in the following years he avenged himself on the knights of the Maghreb and Tripoli for their alliance with the invaders from the east. With irresistible numbers he isolated and laid siege to Maghreb, forcing his way up the steep mountain until he could pound with his engines at the massive black walls. For 38 days the engines beat at the basalt walls, until the knights assembled in the great salle of their eyrie one morning to decide between surrender and resistance until the citadel should lie in ruins and their lives be lost. From the crumbling parapet of the great tower the sentries could look down upon the blue line of the sea, where floated the triangular sails of Moslem dhows, and over white chalk hills where tiny caravans moved through the dust. Maghreb was cut off without hope of aid, and that morning the master of the Hospitallers surrendered the castle, while more than one man brushed the tears from his eyes. The Mamluks, entering the gate tower, looked about them and cried that the angels of Allah must have fought for them and bestowed upon them such a citadel. 4 years later Tripoli fell to their attack, and, with the death of Bohemond VII, the line of the Norman princes of Antioch ceased after a reign of close to 200 years. Except for the small seaports, only Acre remained. Kalawun had ordered the timbers cut for the siege engines, and the sledges of rocks started on the road down from the hills toward this city of the Christians, when he fell ill. Already his armed host had marched forth, and the desert folk were riding up from the plain. The white slaves of the river rode stirrup to stirrup under the black banners, when the Sultan's litter was laid on the ground, and he died. But he gave command that he should not be placed in his tomb until the unbelievers had been driven from Acre. The Qadis said he had been a martyr in the war for the faith, and his son, El-Malik El-Khalil, took the reins of command, ordering the march resumed. As they crossed the Gaza sands, the desert folk came in to the host, and the mullahs, watching from Hebron, could see the glow of the fires. By day the dust of their marching overspread the plain like a veil, when the dervishes ran beside the chargers, and the Arab women sang their exultation in the spoil to be taken. They sang as they marched, and the camel trains coming down from the hills cried a greeting to them. For this was the day appointed, the day for the casting out of the unbelievers, and the final reckoning, wherein the faithful would taste of martyrdom or of honor and riches. So the readers chanted to them, while the camels snarled by the thorn bush, and the chargers stamped restlessly in the lines beyond the fires. Lo, the day of severance is fixed, the day when there shall be a blast on the trumpet, and ye shall come in crowds, when heaven shall open its portals, for the faithful a blissful abode, gardens and vineyards, and damsels with swelling breasts, and a full cup. On this day the Spirit and the angels shall range themselves in order, speaking no word. The sure day, the day on which a man shall see the deeds which his hands have sent before him, and the unbelievers shall say, Oh, would that I were dust. As the debris of a storm, washed down from the hills, gathers in a pile on the plain, the remnants of the Crusaders filled the walls of Acre, and thronged the gardens of the suburbs in that month of March 1291. Most of them had journeyed thither from the hill castles, bringing what goods they could carry with them. The richest of them owned palaces in the suburbs, surrounded by iron grille work and ornamented with windows of coloured glass. Here dwelt the members of the great family of the Ibelins and the Lusignans, émigrés from Palestine, with the Prince of Galilee and the lords of Outremer. In the streets of Acre, between the massive walls of the buildings, all of one height and of the same yellowish stone, rode the Templars and Hospitallers who had been driven from their castles. Under silk awnings, Syrian merchants had their stalls, driving a brisk trade in fine carpets and precious stones. For the émigrés had brought wealth with them, and the Genoese and Venetian merchants, guarded by their men-at-arms, haggled over bargains avidly. Galleons crowded the port, coming and going from Cyprus. Some of the barons were sending their families out to Cyprus, but most of them kept to their houses in Acre, unwilling to believe that the city was in danger. Curiously, the streets were gay, the taverns thronged. Feasting kept up far into the night. Gorgeous prostitutes were seen entering the portals of the palaces, attended by black slaves. Syrian and Greek girls filled the upper rooms of the wine shops and laughed from the windows at the brown-habited monks. Acre was wakeful, alive with a feverish excitement bred of uncertainty. Pavilions stood under the poplar trees of the square between the cathedral and the hospital. Here could be seen the coat of arms of a constable of France, there the shield of Otto of Granson, who had just arrived from Europe. Rumours could be heard in every corner and courtyard, and the galleys coming in from the home ports brought new tidings. Men said that the Pope, Nicholas, had sent out a fleet, while others insisted that no more than a handful of Italian soldiery had been sent, who had already become breeders of trouble. The good friar Ricoldo of Monte Croce had gone out among the Muslims, and perhaps, since he was a holy man, by his aid a miracle might be wrought. It was true that the Sultan Kalawan had died, and this might be the miracle. There were not ships enough to transport a quarter of all these people to Cyprus if the Moslem host appeared and laid siege to the city. In the salle of the hospital, under the carved stone arches, the commanders of the city discussed other tidings. The patriarch, the masters of the orders, were in charge, while they awaited the coming of Henry, king of Cyprus, with his small following of ships. They knew the peril in which they stood, and saw only one chance of succour. A certain Genoese, Buscarel by name, had brought letters from the Mongol Il-Khan, Argun, to the Pope. The Il-Khan said that he was about to invade the Holy Land, and that one of his sons was a Christian. But he demanded an army from Europe to cooperate with him, and no such army was preparing. A converted Mongol, Chagan, had brought a second missive, still more pressing, from the Il-Khan. The only response Nicholas had made was to urge Argun to be baptized. Meanwhile, no one knew what the Mongols were doing, and the Muslim host was on the march. King Henry arrived from Cyprus, and the muster roll of the Crusader families was complete. For these few days they were united, in all the splendour of their small courts, in all the careless indolence that had fastened upon them, generation by generation. With their wives and courtesans they gambled and feasted, anything to drown suspense and gnawing fear, in the moonlit roof terraces where the breath of the sea tempered the lifeless air. The whine of fiddles, the cries of jesters, the modulated voices of minstrels kept them from thinking of the future. They fingered the dice cup and the wine goblet, and let the hours pass uncounted. Restless and quarrelsome they were, degenerate, if you will, yet they kept to their trysting place. Lords and knights, fair ladies and sombre monks, mild nuns and insolent courtesans, bearded patriarchs and heedless minstrels, they gathered for the last time in feverish gaiety to await death. And it came. It came in mid-May, after weeks of siege, with the thudding of fourscore engines, the cracking of boulders against crumbling walls, the flash and roar of exploding naphtha, and the ceaseless summons of the drums. The drums on camelback, scores of them, that dinned and thundered through the hours. Through the gardens of the suburbs, over the smoking ruins of the outlying palaces, surged the host of Islam. Marabut and Haji, Mamluk and Negro roared in exultation. The pavilions stretched to the hills. Oil, poured in the blackened ground and fired by eager hands, sent a smoke screen rolling toward the broken battlements, where the moat had been filled in by columns of beasts of burden, driven forward, laden with faggots and slaughtered at the ditch. Beyond the ruined moat, a breach of 60 yards opened in the wall, and weary swordsmen, blinded by the smoke, waited for the assault to come, while flights of arrows swept over them. The Templars who stood there had regained the breach after one onset, but there was no one to relieve them, and they waited, listening to the diapason of the drums and the songs of the dervishes behind the smoke. Through the night the men of Islam made ready, mustering in 4 waves, the first carrying heavy wooden shields, the second cauldrons of oil and torches, the third bows, the fourth short curved swords, and behind them the regiments of horsemen. Among them, in the half-light before dawn, passed the white-robed dervishes carrying long knives, who would lead the way. Verily, sang the dervishes, Allah had paved the way and had shrouded them with a mantle. For a heavy mist lay along the shore and upon the line of the wall, and the very sea had risen against the unbelievers, so that it barred the unbelievers from flight, tossing their ships in its grip, and delivered them to the swords of the faithful. The drums pounded their summons, and the cymbals clanged. The dervishes began to scream and run through the mist. After them advanced the first wave of the attack. A roar of triumph sounded from the wall, and the oil flared up through the mist, showing the leaping figures of men and the dark masses that surged toward the flames. The clatter of steel sounded faint against the monotone of the drums, and fainter still as the swordsmen were driven from the breach. When the sun broke through the mist, the Muslims were within the breach, and then the tumult that had died down sprang up anew. The master of the Hospitallers with his knights had charged the Moslem waves and thrown back the attack. Then, with a measured tread, the armoured regiments of Mamluks advanced, over the ruined moat, over the piles of bodies and the broken engines, pressing back the wounded knights, forcing their way into the streets, surging around the bands of Christians who tried to beat them off. And behind the Mamluks, the Sultan's cavalry rode into Acre. The drums ceased. Acre had fallen, but for hours and days the Crusaders fought. The master of the hospital begging his men to set him down as he was carried off wounded. The patriarch led on board one of the galleys that soon filled with fugitives, until the heavy swells swamped the overweighted boat, and all within it went down. The Dominicans gathered together, singing Salve Regina, as they were cut down. The Templars holding out in their house upon the sea, until the last boats had got to sea or had been captured, and then surrendering. The knights, disarmed, staring at the exultant Mamluks and Negroes who swarmed into the great fortress, tearing the garments from young girls and laughing as they befouled the altars, until the knights with their bare hands turned on the despoilers and slew them, throwing their bodies out of the embrasures and closing the doors against the Muslims without. And with their hands they defended their house, until fire and steel overcame them, and the last man ceased to breathe. It was the end. By courier and pigeon post the tidings spread through the land of Islam. 30,000 infidels had fallen to the sword in a single day at Acre. The bodies of the Templars had burned in the Black Towers. Elsewhere, in the little seaports, the unbelievers were fleeing. The mighty Acre had fallen, and they were helpless and afraid. Deserted were the halls of Chateau Pèlerin. The swordsmen of Islam walked unhindered through its gates. The last ships were leaving Tortosa, where the cathedral stood empty as a house that has lost its master, and the hymns of the Nazarenes were heard no more. The last ships had gone out to sea, and their sails had vanished under the sky. So said the messengers of Islam, and the camel-men upon the Baghdad road, and the Cadis cried to the multitudes that the jihad had triumphed. Along the coast of the Holy Land, the bodies of the Crusaders lay drying in the sun-heated ditches or in heaps of charred bones. The only living Crusaders were the captives, sitting in rags on the rowing benches of the galleys, or limping under burdens in the alleys of Cairo. Down in the lifeless air of the Dead Sea, their bare feet stumbled over the stones and burning sand. If they raised their eyes, they beheld, far above them, remote under the blazing sky, the ramparts of Jerusalem, where once they had ruled as lords. Afterward. It was the end of the Crusades. The refugees gathered in Cyprus were too weak to think of approaching the coast again, and no further crusade came out of Europe to seek Jerusalem. Ironically, it was then that the Mongol host rode to the Holy Land for the third time under the Ilkhan Ghazan. An army of 90,000 crossed the Euphrates in 1299, and this time it was victorious. Ghazan drove the Mamluks in flight to the south, and was in Damascus in the first days of the year 1300. The Mongols waited out the winter in their camps from Gaza to Aleppo, but saw no sign of the Christian knights. Aware of their approach, the king of Cyprus raided the Egyptian coast with his fleet, and a few ships of the Templars tried to make a landing near Tortosa, without success. Weary at last of holding his ground with heavy losses against the warlike Muslims, and without aid from the Christians, Ghazan, who had received no response to his letters addressed to the Pope, withdrew from Syria in February 1301, and with him vanished the last hope of the Crusaders. Ghazan died in 1304. He had been the ablest, if not the most enlightened, prince of his generation, and while he inclined to the faith of Islam, he had followed the old Mongol policy of religious tolerance in all his lands. He had sought to establish the Crusaders again in the Holy Land as a barrier against the Mamluks. His successor became a true Muslim, and, curiously, with this conversion, the great power of the Mongol Empire in Persia began to decline, as the dominion of the mighty Kublai tended to break up after the latter's conversion to Buddhism in the Far East. Before then, Marco Polo had wandered back from Cathay, and found no one to believe his tale of the court of the great Khan. He was taken captive in a sea battle between the Venetians and Genoese, and had to content himself with dictating the book of his travels to a scribe to while away the hours in his prison. With the breakdown of the vast machinery of the Mongol Empire and the conversion to Islam of the Western Mongols and Tatars, while the Mamluk Empire in Egypt grew in power, the gateways of the East were closed to Europeans, as they had been before the Crusades. Only the neutral Venetian and Genoese merchants and isolated missionaries could penetrate beyond Constantinople and Cyprus. Meanwhile, in Europe itself, a very fever of activity began, with the pen instead of the sword. Geographers pieced out the world that lay to the east, while schools were formed to teach the Oriental languages. Historians gathered together all the chronicles of the Crusades and waged heated discussions as to why the great enterprise had failed. Some of them, at the courts of the kings, blamed the Church of Rome for its exploitation of the Crusades and accused it of keeping in its treasure chests the wealth that had been poured into its alms boxes during the last century. Others, historians of the Church, blamed the ambitions and rivalries of the European princes. Most of them shook their heads over the avarice and treachery of the Italian maritime republics, and added that the quarrels of the Crusaders themselves had resulted in the loss of the Christian colonies. Much was written and little done in this generation between the loss of Acre in 1291 and the affair of the Templars in 1310. Both Edward II of England and Philip the Fair of France took the pledge of the Crusade and raised money for a new enterprise, but they found more pressing matters at home to be paid for with the money. And the theoreticians and amateur strategists poured out plans for redeeming the great defeat. The old project of Constantinople was revived in print. A landing on the African coast and a march to Cairo was urged again. Above all, a complete reorganization of the leadership at home was advocated, control of the preparations to be taken out of the hands of the prelates of the Church and given to a kind of league that would be above tampering with. The temple and the hospital should be united in one order, and rivalry between them eliminated. A fleet should be built to serve the crusade, and the coasts of Islam blockaded. So said the theoreticians, who did not know that the spirit of the crusade had passed from the men at home. In this new age of realism and commercial beginnings, the crusader had no place. Nor could any crusade now win Jerusalem from the rising powers of Islam. From the Golden Horde on the Volga, down through the Ottomans in Asia Minor, through the Ilkhans on the Euphrates, and the Mamluks in Cairo, a ring of weapons had been drawn about the Holy Land, and Europe's task thenceforth would be to defend itself and to fight for its very life against the throngs of Islam. Some of its expeditions would be called Crusades, but they would be only military movement against the new forces of Islam. The true Crusades ended at Acre in 1291, when Jerusalem was lost beyond doubt. Perhaps foreknowledge of this inspired the doctrinaires in their plaint that something should be done to redeem the disaster. In this time of wordy argument and useless conjecture, men turned their attention to the twin surviving units of the Crusades, the temple and the hospital. Both had been driven out of the Holy Land and had lost their strongholds beyond Cyprus. The hospital, the Red Cross of the Crusades, kept on caring for the sick and aiding travellers, while it prepared a new frontier post in the island of Rhodes. Thereafter its knights were known as the Knights of Rhodes, until they retreated to Malta, when they became the well-known Knights of Malta. Not so did the Templars. They had been the transport corps of the Crusades, with the duty of caring for pilgrims, forwarding military units, arranging financing and shipping. They had acted as guides, liaison officers, and shock troops. Their banner, Beauseant, had always had its place in the van of the Christian armies. They had gone into action knowing that they could not retreat, and that if they were taken captive, the Muslims would show them no mercy. More than 20,000 knights of the order had been killed in action. Now the Holy Land, their raison d'etre, was lost. The great organization was thrown back into Europe. It had its frontier post in Cyprus, of course, and in Spain its commanderies found occupation against the Moors, and it kept its fleet in readiness. Meanwhile it had grown vast indeed. European nobles, often with sons in its ranks, had made a practice of willing their property to the temple. Matthew of Paris says that it now held 9,000 houses in Christendom. Having served not only as landowners but as bankers for the later Crusades, the Templars now administered huge amounts of money in trust. In Paris they housed the royal treasury of France and kept its accounts. They guarded the treasury of the harassed papal court, now in exile in Avignon. Because the temple owed allegiance to no lord, and because its members were pledged to take no profit for themselves, the order was entrusted with such treasures. Its fortified commanderies, guarded by the soldier monks, were proof against thieves or robber barons. Even the Pope could no longer influence its councils. In France it had a veritable chain of strongholds, with lands and mortgages upon lands uncounted. It was a state within a state, and once the king, Philip the Fair, had run from an unruly mob in Paris to sanctuary within its doors. Good people shook their heads at sight of this growing wealth, especially in hard times when the burly soldiers of the temple went about well-fed and clad in linens and furs. As defenders of the Holy Land, the Templars had been brave and notable figures, but they were not favourites now when they rode afield to gather interest from a mortgaged hamlet or to claim farms bequeathed to them. They devoted their efforts, said Matthew of Paris, instead of aiding the sepulchre, to administering their properties, and even ruled whole districts like kings. Others blamed the Templars for the defeats in the East, and whispered that they had been in league with the Saracens. Because the Templars held their meetings secretly in the hours before dawn, men said idly that they must have something to conceal, no doubt some evil and unholy ritual. But no one was prepared for what came to pass. Europe crucified the Templars. Or, rather, it made them the scapegoats of the Crusades, and burned alive the best of them. The Trial of the Templars. On the 13th of October, 1307, the royal officers in the governments of France opened seal orders from the hand of the king, Philip the Fair, and found that they were to arrest all Templars wherever found, and hold them to be questioned. In the Paris house was seized Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Order, who had come up from Cyprus at the bidding of the Pope the year before. Philip and his advisers had prepared this step with some care. The wealth of the temple, the imperium in imperio it enjoyed within his own kingdom of France, and its growing political influence, placed a rein upon his ambition. As to Philip, men said that he had the face of an angel, the eyes of a falcon, the body of a giant, and the heart of a devil. Add that he had the agile brain of a scholar, well versed in the law of his day, and you have a man who is to be dreaded. He had talked it over with the Pope, Clement V, a weak soul, an invalid, and now a refugee from Rome at Avignon. The temple had outgrown its bounds. It must be brought to hand, separated from its possessions, placed under authority. Had not its master, de Molay, refused to join the order to the hospital, and accept as its new master a son of the King of France? Indeed, de Molay had refused. Clement, meditating upon the great possessions of the temple, agreed to an investigation of the order. The king suggested that it would be better if he should make the first move, and the Pope agreed. Philip, working with Nogaret, the royal chancellor, and with William of Paris, the inquisitor of France, had planned more than he chose to confide to Clement. The royal officers had brought to him informers, members of the order who had been punished and cast out for various offences. From them the king had gleaned the testimony he needed. He would charge the order with the sin of heresy. Clement, who was making his own plans, did not know of the sealed orders that required the royal officers to interrogate the Templars immediately after their arrest, at need, under torture. And Philip's instructions to his officers contained a full statement of the crimes with which the Templars were to be charged. For long, upon the statement of persons worthy of trust made to us, it has been revealed that the brothers of the Order of the Soldiers of the Temple, hiding the wolf under the semblance of a lamb, and casting despite upon the religion of our faith, are crucifying anew in these days our Lord Jesus Christ, and are heaping upon him injuries worse than those he endured upon the cross. When, at their initiation into the order, they are presented with his image, what must I say? They deny him, thrice and thrice spit upon his face. Following this, stripped of their garments and bare, they are kissed by him who initiates them, first in the back below the spine, then upon the navel, then upon the lips, to the shame of human dignity, and afterwards they are obliged by the vow they have taken, and without dread of offending human law, to yield themselves one to the other whenever required, in frightful lust. These are, with other things, the deeds of that false fellowship, a brotherhood that is mad, and given to idol worship. The arrest of all the Templars in France upon the same day caused a clamour of amazement. The tidings travelled by horseback from village to village, but before public opinion could take definite shape, the royal officers were putting the captives to the question, even before the officers of the Inquisition appeared upon the scene, and the questions were those indicated by the king's instructions. Did you, at your initiation, deny Christ? Have you knowledge that others did so? All of them? Or the greater part? Or a few? Did you spit upon the cross? Did you see others do so? All of them? Or the greater part? Or a few? Monotonously, the long list of questions was read over to each prisoner, separated from his companions. And then, again, when the prisoner was bound upon a wooden frame with ropes stretching, a little at a time, his wrists and ankles away from his limbs. When the bones were pulled slowly from their sockets, the questions were read again and again. Or perhaps the man under question was seated in a chair, bound fast to the back and arms, while an iron circlet was drawn tight upon his temples and twisted into the skin against the bone, and the questions were read to him again. 36 Templars died under this torture. If a man confessed to the charges, he was not put to the torture. Some who had listened to the screams from the torture chamber swore to the full confession without further prompting. It was not necessary to take every man in hand, because the confessions already sworn to before the examiners involved all the commanderies in France. 3 unnamed Templars denied all the charges, and continued to deny them under torture. Faced with the alternative of torture, few were able to go through the ordeal without swearing that part, if not all, the charges were true. So, by the swift action of the royal examiners, the king was supplied with the blackest testimony against the order by the Templars themselves. De Molay's confession was damaging, and it was said that he wrote to the other officers of the order advising them to swear to the charges. Public opinion, at first astounded, and then curious, now had the darkest scandal of Christendom to dwell upon. The soldier monks had indeed practised evil rites in their secret meetings. The very guardians of the sepulchre were servants of Mahound. Little wonder that they had waxed rich and proud when the arts of the evil one had aided them. Still, opinion in general could not make certain of the matter. The Templars had many friends who were angered as well as dismayed, and the Templars in other countries denied the charges to a man. Could it be that these black rites had been confined to France? Philip wrote to the sovereigns of neighbouring countries demanding that they arrest and question the Templars. Clement, at first, had protested. Now he issued in November a bull ordering other princes to arrest the Templars and hold their goods in his name. He sent his cardinals to Paris to oppose the seizure of the property of the Templars in France by the king. De Molay and Hugh of Pirot, visitor of the order, revoked their confessions. Informed of this, the Pope exerted his authority for the first time. It was more than time, because the French king was swiftly overturning one of the very foundation stones of papal authority. The Temple was a religious order, and the king's officers had exceeded their authority in putting its members to the question. Philip, meanwhile, had appealed to the University of Paris on this point, and the masters of theology ruled against him. No secular authority had power to try the Templars, a religious order, on a charge of heresy. Only the Pope had the authority to judge the affair. Reluctantly, the king and his advisers had to admit the papal representatives to the accounting of the property of the Templars. For a few months the whole thing hung in the balance. In that time the persecutors of the Templars showed their ingenuity. A campaign of propaganda was begun, cleverly enough. The text of the confessions somehow came to be circulated among nobles and common people. Disinterested publicists appeared at the papal court to speak indignantly against the order, and it was whispered among the people that if the Templars were found to be heretics, no one in their debt need repay any money owed them. The Dominicans, leaders of the Inquisition, had long been jealous of the soldier monks, and now used their influence against the captives. Men remembered that they had heard others say that drunkards drank like Templars, and the houses of prostitutes in Germany, were they not called temple houses? Details of the inventories of property found in the commanderies were given out to the curious public. So many silver candlesticks and an amber casket found in the chamber of such an officer, a saddle ornamented with silver, so many loads of grain owing to the chapel at Saint-Michel, and not yet paid. One William of Plassien, the mouthpiece of Nogaret, addressed a series of arguments to the papal court, claiming that the case against the order was already clear, and that it was the duty of the papal consistory to punish the guilty members. Plassien's arguments found their way into the hands of the public. It is interesting to look at portions of his summing up. This victory is clearly established and indubitable, because they have avowed in so many confessions the notorious truth. Because of the public outcry they have raised against themselves, and the incontestable testimony of a great and Catholic prince, and the verdict of so many Catholic pontiffs, and the outcry of so many barons and common people, Because since time immemorial, people have reported that in their secret initiation they were guilty of hidden evil, and for that reason they were truthfully suspected by all, openly and notoriously. Because they have always held their chapters and meetings at night, which is the custom of heretics, since those who do evil hate the light. Because by the fruit of their deeds we can know them. It is said that the Holy Land was lost by their lapse. Because in many parts of the world they have fortified their castles against the Church. From all this we must of necessity conclude that the aforesaid deeds are notorious, clear, and indubitable, and so the cause of our faith ought to be safeguarded by the Pontiff of Rome, who safeguards all laws, and is himself not bound by any bond. To bring pressure upon the Pope, the persecutors of the order held what might be called a public demonstration against the Templars at Tours. Philip sent to the Pope 72 of the most damaging confessions. In these years of 1308 through 1309, the confessions had been secured, but the Templars had not been tried because the king and his advisers, unable to try the case themselves, had so frightened the papal council, which should have tried the Templars on the charge of heresy, that the Pope shrank from taking the responsibility on himself. Philip, meanwhile, carried on secret negotiations with Avignon and hit upon a compromise. Clement was to name ecclesiastical commissions to hold inquests upon the testimony. The findings of the commissions were to be presented to a papal council, to be held in Vienne, and at this council the fate of the Templars would be decided. In the interval, the property of the order would be administered by royal and papal officers equally, and the Templars were kept in their cells. Only a dozen members of the order had managed to escape arrest. So the captives saw a ray of hope. At last they were to have a public hearing. 9 members of the order drew up a defence, which was read before a commission. In your presence, reverend fathers and commissioners appointed by the sovereign Lord Pontiff, the undersigned brothers of the order say in response, they protest that whatever the brothers of the Temple have said to the discredit of the order while they were in prison, constrained by requests and fear, is not to the prejudice of the order, and this they will prove when they are at liberty. Under terror and fear, lies will be uttered, and the truth withheld. The greater part of the brethren are so afflicted by terror that it should not astonish you that they lie, but rather it should amaze you that any are found to uphold the truth, when one knows the sufferings and the agonies that they endure, and the menaces they undergo daily, while the liars enjoy comfort and liberty, and great promises are made to them daily. It is amazing that more belief is given to the liars who give testimony in the interest of their own bodies than to those who have died under torture to uphold the truth, and to the great majority who undergo the daily ordeals in prison to uphold the truth. They say that no one has found any brother of the Temple outside of France who assents to these calumnies. That is because only in France have the calumnies been rewarded. Whoever enters into the order pledges 4 things: to obey, to remain chaste, to remain poor, and to devote all his force to the conquest of the Holy Land of Jerusalem. He is given the honest kiss of peace, and stripped of his old garments, and clad in the habit, and given the cross which he carries hanging on his breast thereafter. And whoever says otherwise lies. That is why the detractors and corrupters have sought out apostates or brothers driven out of the order, as sick beasts are driven out of the herd, to concert with them these calumnies and lies, which are now falsely fastened upon the brothers and the order. The brothers were forced to confess to these crimes because the Lord King, deceived by these detractors, informed the Lord Pope of all that had passed, and thus the Lord King and the Lord Pope were tricked by false advice. The brothers who have confessed such things would willingly revoke their confessions if they dared. So they beg that they be given a hearing and enough security to permit them to speak the truth without fear. The response to such defences of the order was definite and unmistakable. In the province of Sens, the Archbishop Philip of Marigny, a man attached to the royal interests, condemned 54 Templars who had revoked their confessions as relapsed heretics. They were carted out at once and burned alive. With the Pope subservient to them, the royal persecutors had only one obstacle to face before the decision at Vienne, and that was the results of the arrest of the Templars elsewhere than in France. These results had not been to their liking. In Italy the affair had gone well enough. Under instructions from the papal court, the mass of lay brothers had been put to the question and adjudged guilty. Many had been burned, and all property confiscated. In England, at first, little attention had been paid to the requests of Philip and Clement for a trial of the order. Then a papal bull, Pastoralis Solis, obliged Edward to arrest the members of the order, and later Clement advised that their testimony be taken under torture. The case was made out against them, and their castles seized in part, but there was no general condemnation. In Spain, the princes were friendly to the order, and saw no advantage in allowing its property to be yielded up to the papal officers beyond their borders. Besides, the Templars there had taken up arms, and made ready to defend their castles, rather than undergo trial. The Spanish princes declared the Templars innocent. Portugal was hostile to the persecutors of the Templars. After interrogation without torture, the order was found guiltless. In Cyprus, a curious thing happened. The Templars were tried twice. The first time, under the king Amalric of Tyre, their friend, they were found guiltless. Then Amalric died, and was succeeded by Henry of Lusignan, an enemy of the order. Henry was instigated by the Pope to try the Templars again, and this time they were convicted of heresy and treason. Their property forfeited, and many of them burned. In Germany, no trial was held. The lay princes rallied to the support of the Templars, forcing the papal legates to withdraw and freeing the captives. When a council assembled to judge them, armed Templars forced their way into the council hall bearing an indignant statement of their innocence. Thereupon the council rendered them public homage. All this proved to be awkward for the papal curia. The order, held to be guilty in France and found guilty in Italy and censurable in England, was at the same time innocent in Spain and blameless in Portugal, not guilty and then guilty in Cyprus, and publicly praised in Germany. Even to the agile minds of the papal jurisconsults, the trial of the Templars was becoming a complex problem. By now the Pope, under pressure from Philip, had shown himself urgent for the condemnation of the Temple, and this circumstance might prove awkward in the extreme, since the Pope was the only individual in all Christendom entitled to judge the order. So it became needful, in the interest of the papacy itself, to condemn the order at the approaching Council of Vienne. Better for Clement if he had never called the Council of Vienne. But there was another side to the problem. Both the Pope and the King had laid their hands on the immense properties of the Temple, wherever possible, and the main object in the thoughts of the Curia and the royal court was the possession of the wealth of the Temple. They would not relinquish that. Such was the situation when, in the autumn of 1311, everybody took the road to Vienne. Clement travelled thither with the papal councillors. Philip moved up to Lyon and sent to the scene his group of emissaries, among them Nogaret, Marigny, Plaisance. These agents held daily conferences with the popes and the cardinals at Vienne, and in spite of the burnings, some 2,000 Templars appeared to defend the order. Public opinion divided into two camps, one party urging the condemnation of the Templars and the cancellation of all debts owing to the order, the other championing the order and demanding a hearing before the Pope himself. This was refused. Clement would not hear representatives of the Temple. 7 of them who persisted in seeking a hearing were imprisoned. But the party friendly to the Templars now held the ascendancy in numbers, and demanded whether the prisoners were to be granted defenders in their hearing before the council. Clement referred this important question to the council for decision, and the answer was that the order must be granted advocates in its trial. This decision made matters worse for the persecutors. If defenders appeared in public with the privilege of offering evidence in favour of the prisoners, the prosecution would be deprived of its one prop, the confessions. For weeks the king's agents travelled back and forth between Philip at Lyon and Clement at Vienne. Nothing but the suppression of the order and the confiscation of its goods would satisfy Philip. If Clement refused, Philip threatened to charge the papacy with heresy. A solution must be found by the papacy, and a solution was found. Philip went himself to Vienne and talked with the Pope. 2 days later, Clement announced his decision before the Grand Commission of the Council and the Cardinals. He declared that the order of the Temple was suppressed. It was abolished, Clement announced, not by a definite sentence, since it cannot be condemned under the law, but by means of an apostolic act. So the trial of the Temple was never held. The Pope dissolved it by his own act. The reason for this act given out to the public were that the order had been criticized, that it had become impotent to aid the Holy Land, and that there was urgent need of a decision in the case so that the property of the Temple might not suffer more by neglect. The property itself was awarded, after payment of expenses to the King of France and to others, to the hospital. But after 20 years of litigation and fighting, the Hospitallers managed to possess themselves of only a portion of this great bequest. Most of it remained in the hands of those who had seized it in the first place. Public opinion showed itself hostile to the Pope's act, and Clement tried to justify himself in the bull Vox in Excelsis of the following spring. By this bull he returned the individual Templars to the jurisdiction of their local tribunals. By so doing, Clement, after refusing the Templars' trial before his council, handed them back to the mercy of the judges who had first extorted confessions from them. They were punished in different ways, and so the impression left upon the world at large was that the Templars, at least in France, had been guilty as charged, and this impression endured until modern times. Only the high officers of the order imprisoned at Paris, Clement reserved for sentence by 3 cardinals. The cardinals sentenced them to lifelong imprisonment. On the Parvis of Notre Dame, before an assembled multitude, the sentence was read to the 4 officers. 2 of them heard it in silence, but Charnay and de Molay stepped forward and protested, retracting their confessions in full, and saying that they knew their only guilt had been in helping thus to injure an order that had been blameless. The twain were taken under guard and hustled off to the provost of Paris. Before anyone could intervene, Philip sent an order to the provost. De Molay and Charnay were led out at night to the island of the river. There, between the garden of the king and the monastery of the Augustinians, they were burned alive at the stake. The Templars, as an order, had been innocent of the charges made against them. They had been disgraced, beggared, and imprisoned by unmistakable conspiracy. Hundreds of them had been tortured, and scores of them burned to death, to satisfy the avarice of a prince of Christendom and the policy of a father of the Church, and the jealousy of the priests and the greed of the people at large. Unheeded at the time, a wanderer upon the highroads, an exile from the city of Florence, heard of their trial, and wrote down a few lines in a curious kind of book that placed the great figures of history in an inferno, or a purgatory, or a paradise at the author's whim. I saw the new pilot, so cruel, that, unsatiated and unrighteous, he carries into the temple his miser's bags. So Dante, who was in his way a judge of character, summarized the action of the French king and the whole proceeding against the Templars. And it bore fruit, this trial of the order. With the passing of the Templars, the ideal of the soldier crusader vanished, and the eastern frontier was left open to the Turks. While at home the trial bestowed new power upon the Inquisition and sanctioned the wringing of evidence from men by torture, while it left the common people seeking in all corners for traces of witchcraft and dealings with Satan, a search that continued horribly for centuries. It is curious that Europe should have burned at the stake the last commanders of the Crusaders. The results of the Crusades. So vast was the crusading movement, and so long did it endure, that no man today may enumerate with certainty its effects. We have no scales in which to weigh the gain or loss of it, nor have we words to describe the effect upon civilization, when whole peoples were torn loose from their isolation and set in motion, to behold new lands, to hear strange languages, and to return with new ideas. But we do know some of the results. For one thing, the Crusades brought back certain gleanings out of Asia, and they caused certain changes in society in Europe, and in the end they resulted in certain contributions to that society. What the Crusades brought back. There were other points of contact between Europe and Asia than the conquests of the cross-bearers. Spain chiefly, and Sicily and Byzantium. So many of the gleanings from the East entered through other channels, but during the 2 centuries from 1095 to 1291, the Crusades established the great boulevard of communication between East and West. In that time the years of conflict were few, the years of truce many, and trade and intercourse practically never ceased. During the Crusades, Europeans became familiar with the finer cloths of the East, cotton and muslin, as well as damask. They began to use cotton paper and a few rare porcelains from China. They learned something of the manufacture of colored glass and mirrors. Rhubarb and spices, rice, sugar, artichokes, and lemons came out of the East during the Crusades, with other fruits and foods. Arabic words still surviving in our language give proof of the new objects and ideas brought out of Asia. These words meet us everywhere, from admiral, alcohol, alfalfa, alkali, algebra, and azimuth, through the alphabet to tariff and zenith. The first Crusaders brought back the windmill with them, and later they adopted much of Oriental heraldry. Christian scholars in Spain and Sicily, as well as in the colonies of the Crusaders, learned much from the Arab scientists, especially in mathematics, where Arabic numerals and algebra simplified all calculation, in medicine, where the Orientals taught the study of disease as a natural phenomenon, to be treated by diet and hygiene, and in astrology. Ptolemy's Almagest was eagerly read. Gradually, the Christians became acquainted with the Arab point of view, that knowledge comes from experiment and observation, and not from a study of religion alone. In time, the Christians would have come to that conclusion of their own accord, but the example of the Orientals quickened their understanding. They discovered that a physician or a mathematician need not be a priest. The Arabs had long been disciples of Aristotle, and European philosophers relearned from them much of Aristotle that had been lost to the Dark Ages. Navigation became simplified by acquaintance with the mariner's compass used by the Arabs, a magnetized needle bound to a straw or splinter of wood floating in water. This invention was crude enough at that time and little used for generations. But by the astrolabe of the Arabs, Christian mariners learned to calculate latitude after a fashion. The explorations of the Crusaders and the study of Arabian geography helped Europeans make useful maps for the first time. The works of Ptolemy and Idrisi became known to them. Returning pilgrims brought back more or less accurate descriptions of all the Nearer East, with fantastic tales of what lay beyond. Sindbad was not the only merchant seaman to write down his itinerary. Christians who had thought Rome to be the center of the habitable world now placed Jerusalem in the center of their maps and became aware of distant seas still unexplored. In architecture also the Crusaders had a hand. Their small cathedrals and chapels were designed after those at home, in the style of northern France. But they learned by their own experience, and by studying the Byzantine citadels, how to build large and habitable castles. From them Europeans learned the advantages of the double system of walls, one commanding the other, of barbicans or outworks, and flanking towers and master towers. So skilled were the artisans of Outremer that Frederick II brought back with him masons, painters, and mosaic workers to ornament his buildings at Palermo. At that time, Palermo and Toledo and Constantinople, all three on the frontiers of the Crusaders, were the centers of culture in Christendom. For 2 centuries the Crusades were the talk of Europe, and men who could write vied with each other in completing chronicles of the great undertakings. At first priests, then soldiers, and then intelligent observers wrote their narratives of events known to them, narratives besprinkled with miracles, with knightly heroism, and with fables. Minstrels added their songs, and from this great outpouring historians like William, Archbishop of Tyre, began to put together connected records of events, sifting true from false. A few ardent spirits studied the Arabic and Byzantine chronicles. The threads of history, lost during the Dark Ages, were taken up again during the Crusades. The changes. 3 portions of Christian society were altered during the Crusades. They would have changed in any event, but they were quickened and remoulded by the stress of the great undertakings. First, the feudal nobility. The barons pooled more than their weight in the wars. The loss of life and the drain of money fell most heavily upon them. For generations such lineages as the Counts of Flanders, of Blois, of Champagne voyaged regularly into the East. Seldom were the lords of Avenay or Coucy or Brienne absent from the frontier. Some families died out entirely. Most of them lost their younger sons, and the whole class yielded place, especially in France, to the kings and the commercial class. Second, the commoners. Many nobles, enlisting for the holy wars, freed their serfs. The bourgeois, who had little social standing at first in Europe, found themselves members of a new and respectable middle class in Outremer, because, although inferior to the nobles, they were above the native population. They owned dwellings and farms in the East, and could seek justice in a court of their own. Seamen and merchants thrived during the revival of trade overseas, and artisans took advantage of the demand for labor. Many peasants, bound to the soil, went off to work as craftsmen in the cities. Third, the Church. At first, the Universal Church of Rome profited vastly from the Crusades. After the capture of Jerusalem in the 12th century, the popes assumed leadership in Europe, until the policy of Innocent III, striving for actual empire, diverted the Crusades to serve his own ends. By abandoning Jerusalem, by keeping for itself much of the treasure raised for the Crusades, and by calling upon the Crusaders to wage war against the heretics at home, the Church of Rome sacrificed the kingdom of Jerusalem, and it lost the popular support that had come to it with the First Crusades. Men who enlisted under the papal banner as crusaders against the Hohenstaufen or in the Languedoc lacked the enthusiasm of the cross-bearers who had sought Jerusalem. At the same time, the constant demands of the papacy for money to carry on the holy wars, while nothing was gained for Jerusalem, and the Roman court grew more and more luxurious, at last outwearied the people's patience. The sale of dispensations, at first only the money claimed from men who had taken the cross and would not or could not go on crusade, changed gradually to the sale of indulgences, freedom from penance enjoyed by crusaders and sold to others who were not crusaders, and eventually to the outright sale of pardons. All this helped bring about the exile in Avignon, and, in time, the Reformation. The contributions. The Crusades themselves shaped the future of our civilization in several ways. The great military orders endured and played their part in events, and left their traces in the fraternal orders of today. Out of the needs of the Crusades grew the first national taxation. To pay the cost of the undertakings, a tithe was levied on the wealth of those who remained at home. A new economic scheme of things had to be devised after the First Crusade, which had been carried on by sacrifice and indomitable purpose alone. Little actual money existed then, and almost no gold coins. The Crusaders needed gold coins to carry on their journeys, silver and the baser metals being too weighty, and these were minted for them. As the throngs of pilgrims increased and the armies of the cross swelled in numbers, more property, cattle, land, or feudal rights, was sold at home to be turned into money, and spent all the way from the Loire to the Rhine to the Jordan. Trading cities thrived along the roads of the wayfarers, and trade grew brisker at home. Not only men, but money and property were put into motion by the great enterprises. The Templars took a step forward in international banking when they arranged for voyagers to deposit money in Paris and receive, in exchange, a letter on which they could draw money again in Acre or Constantinople. The newly founded Italian banking houses in Venice and Florence imitated them, and embarked besides upon the new business of carrying pilgrims east and bringing back merchandise from Asia. On the heels of the cross-bearers, trade routes extended into the east, and merchants went freely to Aleppo, Baghdad, and eventually to India and China. With the quickening of commerce, the setting forth of all the peoples of Christendom toward the east, the long isolation of the Dark Ages was broken. Fleets voyaged from Scandinavia and England into the Mediterranean, whither only venturesome dragon ships of the Vikings had gone before them. Portugal became a port of call, and Sicily turned into a veritable metropolis of the wayfarers. Out of the northern seas the Danes took ship to encounter Hungarians and Lombards in the streets of Jerusalem. Far-wandering Scots argued with worldly-wise Greeks in the squares of Constantinople. Shrewd Venetian adventurers steered their galleons into the Black Sea and made the acquaintance of the ice-bound Slavs. Ships were built larger to accommodate such throngs and made the voyage in fleets for greater safety. The Mediterranean shores became familiar ground, and voyagers returned home with tales of new lands and wonders of the earth. Travel increased between the cities of Europe, and the long stagnation became a thing of the past. With the end of the Crusades and the closing of the eastern trade routes, except such as the Venetians managed to keep open, the voyages did not end. As the gates of Islam were closed against the Christians, seamen began to seek a way around to the Indies and to Cathay, as they called China. In 1270 the Genoese sailed out to look for the Canary Islands, and after the fall of Acre they tried to circle Africa to get to India. The voyages of the Portuguese navigators in the next century were, in reality, an attempt to recover the African coast by crusading venture. And 2 centuries later, Columbus set out to find Cathay bearing the Crusaders' cross upon his sails, trusting that his voyage would pave the way for the recovery of Jerusalem. Instead, he happened upon America. The castles in Syria. Few of us realize that the castles of the Crusaders in the Near East are standing today, for the most part. Travelers in familiar Western Europe will find few vestiges of 12th century building and art, because more modern work has replaced the medieval. But the voyager who is willing to explore the Near East will find whole districts unchanged since the medieval age. The islands of the Knights, Malta and Rhodes, are well enough known and often visited. Since the Italian government has repaired the citadel in Rhodes, a moonlight walk around the ramparts yields the illusion of a return to the 14th century, when the tongues of all Europe manned the walls. And over the half-moon of Smyrna's Bay, the grey citadel of the Knights' Towers, just now a wireless station for the Turkish military. But it is in Syria, at present under the French mandate, that we find almost intact some of the scenes of the Crusades. Above the Syrian frontier there are still some vestiges of the Crusaders, whose cathedrals in Tarsus and Edessa have been turned into mosques. Antioch, just within the border, has been demolished by earthquakes and war, and rebuilt where the old city stood by the river. Only a prostrate granite column shows where the Normans built their Cathedral of the Apostles. But on the heights above the city the medieval wall still stands, half ruined, and the citadel with its foundations atop the gorge of the Iron Gate. In the rugged mountains south of Antioch, the small Crusader castle of Sayun is crouched on its pinnacle of rock, half preserved and overgrown with thorns. On the coast below Sayun, the great Black Margab stands, its upper walls partly broken down, and its lower corridors cluttered with rubble, but with 2 stories of its round tower intact, and its chapel undamaged. The tower wall is badly cracked and will soon fall, while the chapel roof has been repaired. A few Arab families, some 25 people with the usual children, black goats, dogs, live within the castle's outer circuit, and a small forest has grown up in the reservoir. Still farther south, and on the eastern side of the mountains, Masyaf stands guard over its village, but with Syrian infantry, not assassins, quartered round it. The tawny outer walls have not fallen in, and the entrance tower, the strong point of an Arab-built castle, is fairly clear. The interior has collapsed in part since, as in most Arab castles of the time, mortar was not used to hold the stones in place. Here begins the heart of the castle country, where one is often within sight of the other. Tortosa, one of the strongholds of the Templars, is overbuilt by a small Arab coast village, but the lower courses of the great walls are standing, and the Cathedral of Our Lady is deserted, its twin towers vanished, near the Muslim cemetery. Safita's massive and lofty tower is sound enough, but the outer circuit has half disappeared under the Muslim village. The mighty Croix de Chevalier, standing aloof on the summit of a round hill, has endured for 8 centuries. The Arab families have appropriated it, and its courtyards swarm with sheep and camels and varied filth. The chapel, however, has been kept clean, and around the entrance to the salle, now dark and desolate enough, the Crusaders' ornaments in stone are still intact. Out on the coast, Raimond's castle of Tripoli, they call it that, looks down on the modern alleys of the seaport. It has been used for nearly everything, including a stable and a Turkish prison, and has more than half fallen to pieces from neglect. In France or Germany, the Croix would have been a mecca for sightseers. Below the modern resort of Beirut, the twins Saladin and Tyre, now known as Saida and Sur, show more than remains of the Crusaders' work, although the Turks overbuilt them. Ruins of St. Louis Castle, with a single enduring tower, crown the land side of Sidon. Inland, 2 other twins, Belfort and Bagnas, are much better preserved. In fact, Belfort is a wonder, with its long corridors built into the rock, its embrasures peering out on a seemingly bottomless gorge. Across the border in Palestine stands the Acre region, with its arc of protecting castles that sheltered Nazareth. Turon, Montfort, and Safed lie in ruins, while the black citadel of Tiberias traces its circuit through the drowsy streets of the little town by Galilee. In the heart of Acre itself, the buildings of the Crusaders are clearly visible, especially the quarters of the Hospitallers. South of Acre, the almost impregnable Kaukab al-Hawa, Star of the Winds, and Chateau Pellerin are half ruined, but impressive still. Of the churches and chapels of the Crusaders, less remains. Many were converted into mosques and overbuilt, while Baibars and the Kharesmians destroyed the holy places of the Nazarenes ruthlessly. Nazareth itself and Mount Tabor, that had been a fortified monastery with an abbey, and had been besieged and captured and retaken many times, he destroyed stone by stone. In the Jerusalem region also the Mamluks wrought havoc, but Baibars and all the Muslim conquerors spared the church at Bethlehem. Saladin preserved St. Anne's at Jerusalem. The work of the Crusaders is visible all through Jerusalem, from the tiny marble altars in the Cavern of the Souls to the beautiful pointed arches of the Sepulchre courtyard. And throughout the region round the city, their handiwork is to be seen, from the small cathedral of Ramlach to the great mosque of Hebron. In Jaffa and Ascalon their handiwork has almost been obliterated. Out in the island of Cyprus, however, their castles stand, and their cathedral at Nicosia. The Crusaders' castles in the east have passed from hand to hand, and have been neglected for some 7 centuries. They have been used as quarries when convenient, and as robbers' haunts and tenements for wandering Arab villagers. Few people know of them or visit them, except in the citadels of Rhodes and Malta, built after the Crusades. And although the French High Commission in Syria is discussing measures to preserve the Croix, it is doubtful if any attempt will be made to save the castles from final destruction. They remain deserted in a half-deserted country, and the very Arabs who live in their shadow know no more of them than that they are there. The sheep graze on their mountain slopes, the cactus climbs over the rubble beneath them, and lizards scurry across their great stones when the sun is warm. They look down on the same countryside as before, where the camel strings pass and solitary horsemen go by in silence. The cisterns are heavy with green scum, and wind blows through the cracks in the towers. The land has not changed, but the men have gone from it. They are old, these castles, and the hills are steep. Hot is the sun at the desert's edge, and heavy the rain. In time they will crumble into the hills, forgotten monuments of vanished men. What we moderns think. For 2 centuries of the 1,000-year strife between Islam and Christianity, the cross-bearers carried the war into Asia. They fortified themselves beyond the sea, making the valley of the Jordan the front line of Christendom. At the end of the 2 centuries, they were driven out of this front line because they were left without support in the face of the new Muslim forces drawn from Central Asia. Counter-attacks launched from Europe failed to recover this ground, and in the next centuries the Muslim attacks swept on over the Mediterranean and into Eastern Europe. The Crusaders sacrificed themselves in taking and holding that front line. While they were on the Jordan, the rest of Europe, except in Spain, where the Crusaders also appeared before long, was safe from Muslim aggression. And after the Crusaders were wiped out, the experience gained in their wars, the new weapons and lessons learned in strategy and in fortification, and especially the new fleets built up during the Crusades, aided in the preservation of Europe when Christendom was placed on the defensive. So, as a military venture in that long war, the Crusades gained much. The loss was in the sacrifice of lives and wealth, the gain in experience. So says the soldier. With all this, the scoffer will not agree, and just at present he is very much in fashion. He sees in the Crusades a waste of hundreds of thousands of lives and uncounted wealth. He reminds us that the first cross-bearers ate human flesh at need and stained their swords by savage massacres, and that later adventurers and plunderers filled their ranks. It seems to him that these men set out to be saints and ended by being devils. He decries the whole thing as a failure. The scoffer, however, is weighing men of the 12th century in scales of the 20th. If he had lived when the Crusaders lived, he would have known that other men as well had eaten human flesh at need, that the Crusaders ceased the massacres after the first onrush, when they had settled in Outremer, and thereafter the Mamluks, for example, equalled the worst of their deeds, that the feudal and political wars of the peoples in Europe went on continuously, while there was peace in Jerusalem after the Crusaders' conquest for 80 years, and even truce at home during the Great Crusades. That the venturesome Crusaders, instead of looking for fortunes in the East, sold or mortgaged their property at home in order to journey into the East, and gained little thereby. That instead of regarding themselves as saints, they were usually men who set out on crusade to expiate their sins. And so great was the peril of the venture that the Church accounted it the most arduous penance of all. That, so far from being a failure, the people of that time looked upon the conquest of Jerusalem as a triumph, and the relics brought back as more than compensating for the losses. Today the cynic is quite the vogue, and his voice outcries the idealist. But there is, after all, something ignoble in belittling a mighty and unselfish undertaking, and in defacing the memory of men who sacrificed themselves. Nor does it become us of today, who have seen our world plunged into war for no apparent cause, to cast stones at those who fought during 2 centuries for what they believed to be the greatest of earthly causes. We of today have rebuilt the Forum of the Caesars and many temples, But we cannot restore the kingdom of Jerusalem, where our ancestors sought, beyond the sea, to dwell beside the tomb of Christ in peace. It is vanished with the dream of Godfrey of Bouillon and the exhortation of Saint Bernard, the ambition of Coeur de Lion, the pitiful seeking of the children, the devotion of Saint Louis. The city is lost, the kingdom a memory, the chivalry of Outremer scattered, and the gardens and cathedrals built so patiently beyond the sea stand deserted, or house the new hordes of Asia. And it will never return again. That day when the Crusaders built their little crude paradise around the sepulchre is past. When, after centuries, Christian pilgrims made their way back slowly to Jerusalem, they found ruins ill-tended by the Muslims. They found the chapels of the Crusaders and the Garden of Gethsemane. They watched the sunsets darken over the Tower of David, and they stood by the pool where once an angel had troubled the waters. But they saw these things with changed eyes. They rebuilt the ruins, but not the city of which Godfrey had dreamed. No one can rebuild the lost city wherein for 80 years the faith of the Crusaders lifted them out of the current of a merciless age. So says the idealist. Say what we will, the Crusades will endure as a cherished memory. We wonder at them. Perhaps we do not understand them. For to their own dark age the Crusaders brought the fire of unselfish purpose. Around this fire they drew men from all lands, centuries before the first alliance of peoples in our modern world. And by this light they went out into the unknown regions centuries before Europe could send forth its colonists. And this spirit of the Crusades was not in the world before they came, and it has not appeared again after their passing. No words of ours can alter what these men did, the best or the worst of them, who followed a star. They drained the cup of devotion, and if they tasted the dregs of shame, they knew also the exultation of victory. They reached the summit of daring, and the memory of that will endure long after our own workaday lives are ended.
Thank you for listening to this audio connoisseur production. We are dedicated to bringing the world's finest literature to an audience of discriminating listeners. If you would like to place an order, would like information about our fine products, or if you have questions and comments, please visit our website at www.audioconnoisseur.com. At this website, you may listen to samples from all of our productions. You may send email to information@audioconnoisseur.com or call us toll-free at 866-388-8899. And thank you again. We value every single listener. This production was narrated by Charlton Griffin.